Helito and welcome. Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon O'Loughlin, citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the CEO and attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs. And next to me is Miss Debra Yepa-Pappan, who's from the Jemez Pueblo and is also Korean. She's the community engagement coordinator for the Field Museum and also an artist and many other things. As you can tell from what is stated in our agenda and just seeing myself and Deborah here, we're missing two of our panelists. We are assured that they are on their way and that there could be some technical delay, but that's not going to delay this panel and the wonderful things we're going to talk about here, which is our panel called Changing Perspectives on Native American Cultural Heritage. And what we are, oops, I better get up my notes here. What we really want to talk about is, we've seen a huge shift in how institutions and how the public are viewing Indigenous peoples' items. NAGPRA, for one hand, has kind of laid the groundwork for a new way of looking, not a new way to Indigenous peoples, but a new way for Western institutions to view Native American cultural heritage. Other countries are also moving towards a huge change of ideology and in what's going on in their museums and institutions, and they're working towards developing repatriation policies to return items that have been taken during various colonial eras. There's also these terms that are starting to get, we're starting to see some movement in how they are, how we look at these terms such as art. What is art when it comes to Native American cultural heritage? What are antiquities and artifacts? Are these really just kind of disguised terms for what we all know is Native American sacred and cultural patrimony and other sensitive items? So we're going to be talking a little bit about those changing perspectives. And let me first, before we go any further, I want to say thank you all for being here. It's a little bit later in the evening. Hopefully everyone's got themselves a little plate of food, eating some dinner maybe, or they're just getting done with work. Glad you're here. I want to make a couple of, point a couple of things out. There is a chat. Feel free to use the chat. Say hi, tell us who you are, tell us where you're coming from. There's also a Q&A. So the chats are really good if you want to have side conversations or commenting on what's happening. The Q&A is a great tool if you want to ask the panelists questions. Then we can use that Q&A to know that you have some questions. And then we also have a raised hand function. We can actually bring you all out there watching the session into the conversation with us with your video and your audio, so that you can participate in the conversation and ask questions more directly and orally if that's more comfortable than the chat function. So that's what we got there. I want to point out first off, before we get started, Deborah, Desiree loves the earrings. I shared the wrong thing. There it is. She loves the earrings.
I was gonna say that's the most important thing to discuss right now in this moment. Yes. These are earrings by Bobby Wilson. I saw on Facebook that today is his birthday, so that's why I wanted to wear these today, to just wish him a happy birthday in that way. But I'm also just really happy to be here. So thank you, Shannon, for this invitation to join this discussion with you. And I know that we've been trying for a couple years now to try to do something like this together. So I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Thanks, Deborah. And please feel free to go ahead and if you want to introduce yourself, please.
Okay, yeah. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'm Deborah Yepa-Pappan. I live here in Chicago. I'm on the ancestral homelands of Potawatomi, Odawa, Ojibwe peoples, as well as Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Meskwaki, Sac and Fox, Peoria, and many others that have had relationships with this land here in Chicago or in Potawatomi. Potawatomi folks had a name for this place already, and it was Chicagoinak. And I believe the Ojibwe name is Shigagong. So I'm happy to be here. I'm a visual artist as well as the Native Community Engagement Coordinator at the Field Museum. As many of you may know, that the Field Museum is undergoing or has been undergoing major redevelopment and renovation of the Native American Hall. And in the process, we've been working with a lot of Native collaborators, which includes a lot of Native artists. And so, you know, that always has me thinking. I'm constantly, because I'm in that space so much and I'm working with so many different amazing Native people from all over the country. You know, I think about it a lot. I'm around a lot of our, you know, our heritage there at the Field Museum. And so, you know, I think about them. I think about, you know, the items that are in there, why they are there. You know, those are discussions we have. And as a visual artist, just to, you know, briefly talk about another venture that I'm involved in with a collective of Native artists here in Chicago, we've created our own space called Center for Native Futures, which we're hoping to open maybe within the next year, I hope. We're in process, but we are a 501c3 organization, and it's just, you know, it's built upon a long dream that we've had to create our own space dedicated to Native artists by Native artists. And, you know, that's what we've had to do, right? We've had to take agency in you know, creating our own space so that we're telling and sharing our own art and our own stories in our way and in the ways that we know are, you know, in better practices or in Indigenous ways for Native people, and in how we care for each other, how we support each other, and looking into the future. And so that's why we called ourselves Center for Native Futures, because we're definitely looking into the future as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about me right now.
Thanks, Deborah. And so let's just make a party of this. So for whatever reason, we haven't been able to get Dallin, Maybee, and Cinnamon. See, I love her first name so much, I always forget her last name. Cinnamon Catlin-Legutko. Did I say it correctly, Deborah?
Catlin-Legutko.
Or joining us, and until they're able to join us, let's just go ahead and get started. And I want to invite, please, from the audience, if you have any conversations or discussion or questions, we're happy to invite you in here on video with us, or please feel free to chat and ask questions, and we will include that as we talk. So the way our panel is formatted is we're going to have it basically an informal kind of table talk kind of conversation about how perspectives are changing regarding how we're all thinking about protecting Native American cultural heritage. And the first question I had really was, we talked a little bit about this in a previous panel, was, you know, there's a recent exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called The Art of Native America. And it showcased some of the private collection of the Diker family. And I kind of wanted to know, from your perspective as an artist in working in Indian country and also dealing or working within a museum, you know, what's your opinion of this exhibit of what was called Native American art? And while you do that, I'm going to bring up some of the pictures. I'm going to try to bring up some of the pictures that we have from that exhibit. So, yeah, what do you think, Deborah?
Yeah, we did see, we went to New York last year before, or actually it was like right like at the beginning of, the pandemic, before everything shut down. So we actually were able to see that that exhibition. And I think it's always interesting that, art museums and art institutions, it doesn't matter where you go, whenever they have Native American art, Native American collections in their museums, they're always, anthropological or ethnographic materials. You don't often or very much see a lot of, art by contemporary artists or contemporary art. And I always think it's interesting too that sometimes, I question like sometimes who's curating Native American art. I feel like, and I mean, this is more a recent thought, or maybe like a recent, observation about, why is it that Native art is always relegated to anthropology, or Native art is curated by anthropologists, whereas, European art or other American art is curated by art historians, or, definitely curated in a different way. So, I question like I'm always looking at the lens through which our items are put on display, the words that they use. So really, like, yeah, here emphasizing shaman, always, associating us with spirituality and like all these tropes of Native people, right? Yeah.
And what I find interesting too, Deborah, about this, not to interrupt you, and it looks like Dallin is joined us. Hey, Dallin, say hello. Throughout the Met's exhibit, glad to have you there, Dallin.
I apologize. I thought we were a half an hour out still. I'm not sure why I had the wrong time for the panel.
That's okay. Hey, we're glad you're here. We're all glad you're here. What I was about to say is that this, and throughout the Met exhibit, they describe every single thing, even items that are funerary and sacred items, done by an artist, right? An Egyptian artist. So that they don't talk about that person being a practitioner of culture or of religion for the tribe, or the actual purpose of that person and the role and what they meant. They're looking at it purely as a piece of art. So I'm going to pause right there and stop sharing. And I really want, Dallin, your light is really bright if you can tone it down. But we want you to introduce yourself and join the conversation. Sorry to make you. I'm sure you were going to put a tie on, a little makeup,
earrings.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Shannon. And good to see you guys. As she mentioned, my name is Dallin Maybee. I am enrolled Northern Arapaho, but I grew up on my dad's territory in Seneca Nation of Indians, Cattaraugus Territory in Western New York. And I've kind of had a bit of a varied professional background, everything in fine arts to performing arts. I got a law degree from ASU in federal Indian law, and I am currently the Assistant Director of Development for the Native American Rights Fund. Prior to this job, I was over at the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts as the COO and eventually Executive Director. So it's been great to be around fine arts and find those intersections of what is appropriate and what isn't. And I think we're going to kind of get into that a little bit today. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now we're talking about the Metropolitan Museum of Art and their exhibit that they call Native American Art. And I don't often show pictures of items because if I don't know and if I don't have permission to share a particular type of item from that tribe, I'm not going to share it. Though museums often choose to do so just because they have the item in their collections. So oftentimes I will only take pictures of the label. So I was sharing some of those labels, but Dallin, what did you think of the Metropolitan Museums of Art, their Native American art exhibit?
Well, when I first got into Native fine art as an artist, I quickly sort of learned where our cultural boundaries were. And that just comes from mostly personal experience with other artists, with other tribal members, with your family, who kind of tell you where the gray areas are and where things are totally inappropriate, because we are very, very good at policing ourselves and letting other people, especially family members, know when something is borderline not okay, right? But what's interesting is museums often don't have that luxury. They are often left to their own educations, internal politics, and internal archaeologists and curators who can only glean information from provenance of a piece. Maybe they have a friend or two or something that is from that tribe and might be able to give some cultural context to a piece. So whenever I go into any museum, especially non-tribal ones, I do so fully prepared to see something that might raise an eyebrow or even give me the wholehearted, holy crap, I can't believe they're showing this kind of thing. Whether the museum, it's like the Museum of Man in San Diego had a child's mummified body on display for years, and then it moved to a picture of the body. And then eventually they pulled it with enough outcry and hopefully a change in paradigm. And so when I approach these collections, I do so with a grain of salt, knowing that perhaps they haven't had the luxuries that I have as a tribal member or as an artist. But I've definitely gotten more outspoken, and I will reach out to the powers that be to let them know, hey, you may want to consider a different approach. Because while it's great to see some of these objects on display so we can appreciate the beauty and the technique and all the awesomeness that comes from our culture, there's still plenty that just, God, we're baby steps forward, I guess, still, right? But what's encouraging is to see Native curators filling some of these positions, folks like Deborah who are right in the middle of it, doing what they can, making those fights in their places, and as much as they can. And that's sort of the collective effort that we all need to be engaging in to steer the ship a little bit better for ourselves.
So I stopped sharing, and thanks, Dallin, for that. I want to bring up Cinnamon. Thank you. I'm so glad you were able to join. I'm sorry for any technical difficulties. Cinnamon, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, and greatest apologies. The state of Illinois has its difficulties with technology, and it showed me again how difficult they are. So I apologize. My name is Cinnamon Catlin-Legutko. I'm the director of the Illinois State Museum, located in Springfield, Illinois, presently, which are the ancestral lands of the Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, and Peoria peoples. So I'm very pleased to be with you. I've just been with the institution for just over 2 years, and prior to that, I was at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor for 10 years, working with Wabanaki people.
Yeah, and Cinnamon, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like people to get to know you a little bit more about the work that you've done previously at the Abbey Museum and why it's so important that we have you now in Illinois. can you give a little transparency and talk about what you're doing in Illinois?
Absolutely. I have the privilege of working in Bar Harbor with an extraordinary group of board members and staff who made the commitment in 2012 to rethink museum practice. We call it decolonizing work. Of course, that leads to many roads. But for us, it was a commitment to lasting change. We adopted numerous protocols. We followed the work of Amy Lone Tree around decolonizing work, really focusing on collaboration, privileging Indigenous perspective, and truth-telling as our frames for the work that we were doing. The Abbey has a long history, an archaeological story, as well as your traditional museum interpretations. In that process, we stopped doing archaeology. We turned over curatorial duties to Wabanaki curators. Everything changed. It's like take a shirt and turn it inside out, and that was the new way. And it was to be Native-led, Native-determined, from the strategic planning to policy development, everything. So by the time I left, the majority of the board were Native and continue to be, and they continued to grow from that process. And that was why, in part, I think I was invited to join the Illinois State Museum, because the ISM has a lot of work to do. And the first starting block is truly around NAGPRA and working to return home nearly 7,000 individuals. And as my colleague, and I know Deborah's a fan of Ben Garcia, says, I'm here on a rescue mission. There's been a lot of under-resourcing, waiving commitment through the years to NAGPRA, some really good work, but right now we need to just change the pattern. So we are actively working in repatriation and then moving beyond into other works around collaboration with tribal communities. We're just getting started, but it's exciting. And the milestones are already showing themselves. And we'll have a lot more to say in a few years, but the big priority right now is focusing on repatriation.
Great. I'm glad to have you, Cinnamon. So now that we're all here together. Thank you. Let's continue our discussion about changing perspectives. And we were talking a little bit about the Metropolitan Museum of Art and talking about the difference between museum perspectives, artist perspectives, and Indigenous perspectives in looking at an exhibit like that, which was a mix of contemporary Native American art, which I will absolutely label as art, with culturally and religious sensitive items that are part of the private collection of the Dykers, on loan to the museum in order to display those items. Cinnamon, did you want to add to that conversation at all, or discussion about that exhibit and what you think about it as a museum? Someone from another museum?
Yes. I have had the opportunity to visit the exhibit when I was living in Maine, went to New York and saw it. And there was a lot of conversation in the media and, of course, among colleagues around it at the time. And I remember being very conscious of the show opening, going to see it and realizing that it was truly a first for them. And I think we know for sure they took multiple missteps. I don't know if they would say that, but they did. Anybody who knew anything would walk in and know that everything you were seeing was sacred. I mean, it was so obvious how it had been handled. And it felt very performative. The ways that they integrated Native voice, they really tried, but I was like, wow, I don't know that this full conversation happened. And the curatorial role from tribal folks was very unclear. So I just remember at the time thinking, this is a human rights issue. It continues to be a human rights issue, but golly, Matt, with all of your resources, surely you can move into action. And so I did check this morning. I was like, what have they done? Because I don't know that I've seen anything lately. And of course, the show's still up. They have hired a chief diversity officer this year. They also have a land acknowledgement that they installed this year. I can't remember when that show opened, but I still lived in another part of the nation. So it's been a while. And there's no other evidence of action really happening as an opportunity. And the show just continues on. I think it's problematic in so many ways. And I know that it's donor led in so many ways. And with that, you have a power differential that so many museums refuse to acknowledge and argue with or find a different way. And it continues to be problematic and harmful. And that's my viewpoint. I don't know that my colleagues in the museum field widely say those things, but I've gone on record a few times to say that, and my opinion continues.
That was really helpful, Cinnamon. Thank you. And I think coming from a museum perspective, right, coming from a director or curator perspective to the Metropolitan Museum of Art has, I think, greater weight in this instance than coming from me or Deborah or even Dallin. And I hope that those of you out there in the museum industry, should make your voices heard when we see other institutions doing it wrong. I think that's part of moving towards, changing our perspectives on these issues and what's okay and how it's okay to have an exhibit with Indigenous people's cultural heritage and sacred objects. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A I'm happy to go to. One from Wendy Teeter. This is a little personal. You both do work that connects past, present, and future realities. How do you approach curators that want to pigeonhole you or your work in one way or another? So Deborah and Dallin, I think this may go to you and your work as artists.
Yeah, fortunately, I haven't had to really work with a lot of non-native artists or curators. I mean, I've had the, just privilege of working with native curators. They approach me and ask me about my work, or I don't feel like I've ever really been pigeonholed. I kind of want to share a little bit, but not give you too much information about a recent experience, though. It seems like there's like this huge boom right now on museums wanting to show their Southwest pottery collections. So, because we know so much of Southwest pottery that was commercially made, are just in all different parts of the country and in different collections. And it seems like these folks are trying to do the right thing by reaching out to and talking to like one Pueblo person. And there is a museum that's nearby in the state that I went to visit, and I don't feel like I was pigeonholed, but I felt like I'm not a potter. Yes, I'm Pueblo, but I grew up here in Chicago. But I felt like I was expected to be the expert, and I just kind of turned into like, just the work that I do in like challenging and questioning, process and how they're doing things and how they're thinking about this pottery exhibit. It was just, I found there's so many things that were problematic. And this person, I suggested that this person need to talk to Pueblo potters. And, it's important to me as an artist, if I'm going to be asked to be involved in the show in some way, as far as like giving a presentation about my own work, I'm associating my work with the show and how it's being displayed. Integrity for me is such a huge important thing that I don't know if I want to be associated with this exhibit if the pottery and their makers are not going to be honored in the right way or in the way that should come from a I think a Native curator needs to be involved, or more Pueblo people or more Pueblo potters need to be involved in this. But yeah, I mean, if there were somebody that were trying to pigeonhole me, again, I really question everything about how they're going about, and I would challenge how they're going about curating the exhibit.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm always sort of sensitive to the fact that we all don't know what we don't know, right? And so we're as Native people, we're all posed with very ignorant questions sometimes, or concepts or ideas about who we are as a people and as a culture. And they look to the only Native who they have available for the answers. And whether that's us or it's somebody more appropriate, I always go back to our ceremonies. They tell us that we are the people, we are the sky people, we are people who have been given these ceremonies to help us navigate our way through this very complicated life. And we have a lot of traditional concepts, but in those concepts are the ideas that we are very much one people amongst many different types of people. And so whether it's us or whether it's somebody more appropriate, I try to definitely have a lot of compassion, because our ceremonies teach us, I'm speaking from my own tribe, they teach us that, we have to pity the people who don't understand who we are as Arapaho people, let alone Native people, or really even who they are as human beings. And so, I think it's easy to get offended, but it's a lot harder to show compassion and just simply take that step forward with a little bit of humility and then educate. And so I engage in a lot of different mediums as an artist. I get to work in a lot of different legal areas, and just simply observe, right? And this narrative around repatriation and our sacred objects being held by other people, either for us or against us, until we're able to get them returned. It's a lot more complicated question, I think. And so when I find people who want to pigeonhole my art or only want to engage in one dialogue, I did an interview today with a young man who was writing a paper, and his slant was very pro-Native. It was the media has misrepresented Natives for years, decades, centuries. And that's absolutely true, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And so I choose to pity them a little bit, understand that they might be highly educated children when it comes to understanding the spiritual context of our objects or our relatives, or the things that are spiritually important to us. And so I guess what I'm saying is keep fighting the fight. I think that's what we're asked to do when we are on the front lines of these conversations and engaged in these narratives. But keep in mind who they are and what they really don't know. We are all human beings at the end of the day.
Well, and I think that's why, relationship building is important, right? It's important to have, those conversations and have it go, both ways. I also feel like, I get approached for some of these things like at the last minute, or like down to the last hour. And I think that's another thing that people need to be more aware of. Curators, especially, or anytime an exhibition is being developed, build in that time to create partnerships, build in that time to learn and understand, right? Because without that, then you're doing everything like that's down to the wire, and you're not really, you're not really authentically doing that work, and then you're not honoring the voices that need to be heard. So yeah, I think, I think that's what frustrates me is when I get asked to participate and it's like 2 months to the opening. I'm like, that's not enough time. So, really giving time, and it seems like people never have the time, but we need to make that time.
I really like that, cultivating relationships. I think that's so important. Easier to have these conversations, these challenging conversations with allies rather than somebody who is a little afraid of us, right?
Yeah, because then otherwise it just feels extractive or, exploitive. And I think, when we're invested in each other in a relationship, we care about our friends, right? And that comes about by building relationships. So if we have a relationship and we become friends, hopefully somebody would care enough about us, right, that they would want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Shannon.
Of course. So let's take a step further back and talk about, what's the purpose of a museum and what should be in a museum. What do you all think about that? And maybe I should start with Cinnamon, because that's the job she has in front of her right now. What do you think is the purpose of a museum and what should it be doing?
Well, I can share why I do the work, right? Why I believe museums exist. And technically, they're places of informal learning, free choice learning, right? You opt in to go learn a little something. That audience is very small. And the other side of that equation is folks then decide in the museum space what you need to know, right? So there's this problematic equation that has persisted through the years. But to begin with, museums were created to help us make sense of the world, right? We didn't travel. We didn't have the media like we do. That's why you have so many museums start up as encyclopedic museums. The ISM is an encyclopedic museum. We have things in the collection that have nothing to do with Illinois, and the numbers are vast in terms of what we have. But it was started in 1877 for the people to understand the world. But today, they truly are about that informal learning spaces. And unfortunately, the equation hasn't shifted enough on the museum worker side to realize how exclusive they are. And I've started saying this a lot where I work, in that our job is to share the story of Illinois. And there's no way that the few people who work here have the right to share that story. There's no way. You could never make that argument in any other playing field, but yet that's how we're set up. And so to do that, you have to make space, make mechanisms, make resources available for community partners, community voices. Those relationships you just talked about have to be built from the ground up and sustained and nurtured and made dynamic in every space, right? So the decision-making begins at the beginning, not halfway through or 2 months before a deadline. That's the museum of the future, where community voices are everywhere and all the time. Because then you have people with authority, lived experience, sharing what you need to know, right? Not the few who get that privileged workplace. I think that's this little pivot point we're in right now in the museum field. Like, are we going to tip to that opening of structure? Or are we going to stay in this hoarded little space of just a few people who get to work here? But at the end of the day, it's free choice learning. And if only privileged people are choosing to be in that space, we haven't done our job. I believe museums should exist because of all those reasons. Where else, especially as an adult, do you get the chance to go deep in your learning, jump off onto a new idea? You're supposed to visit museums and begin your learning journey. We're not going to give you all the answers, but we're going to tip you off into some directions you're supposed to go in and keep learning. There aren't that many institutions like that for adults, not to mention children in informal learning. We need to exist, but we need to quit being part of the harm equation.
Right, which is like, so what should museums be educating about? Should they be storage mechanisms for our bodies.
Right.
You know, our indigenous and enslaved peoples and people from other marginalized communities. Should it be for their bodies, or what should it be? Dallin, what do you think?
Oh, I was just going to say one
Go
quick thing. With that opening up mindset, you can see how that would drive collections decisions, right? Exactly. We would change our storage models. We would change the square feet we occupy. There's still always going to be a need to hold for future generations. I get that. But the lenses we've used for that decision making have been problematic.
Yeah, I always thought institutions would save so much money if they would go through the process of NAGPRA and remove those items that don't belong to them, return them and repatriate them, and re-examine what they should be educating about, right? And I think that's what many institutions are going through today. What, Deborah and Dallin, what do you all see in there?
So I think that's what she was saying was absolutely right. You know, the museums aren't meant to be crypts, right? But that's de facto what they are because of this idea of research and education and trying to understand a culture for whatever reason 200, 100 years ago. But, you know, we're in the midst of this, again, social justice narrative that allows us to have a bigger voice than probably we would usually have, even in the museum field. You know, some museums get it. Dr. Teeter and the Fowler, you know, she's over there fighting a huge paradigm. But when I was there at UCLA, I was so impressed to go there and see spaces that she had created so we could simply pray for those people and those objects that they had and do appropriate ceremonies. You know, when we talk to our Gajisats and our false faces, we take care of them because they are still living spirits, right? They represent very real, tangible things to our Haudenosaunee culture. But again, it goes to this paradigm of, again, redefining what a museum should be. And thankfully, we are having conferences, we're engaging with participants who are in these worlds and can assert a measure of influence. Now, how fast or slow that takes, I don't know. You know, it's frustrating. I see it in the fine art world. Obviously, the frustrations are there in the museum and curatorial world. But by God, we fight for our people. We fight for our sacred objects because we are fighting an entire paradigm. And so, you know, I hope we can continue to be part of these dialogues and conversations, as uncomfortable as they may be for this paradigm of the people that be. But I'm optimistic. I'm seeing things now that we didn't see 30 years ago. You know, what will we see in another 10 or 20 years? Yeah.
I'm gonna redirect the conversation for a minute, Dallin. We have a question about something that you have on your shelf, and why you have that on your shelf. Oh, you're muted as far as the medicine faces.
Oh yeah, so that's my own little repatriation project, right? Long story short, they are we have a society that in Longhouse where we use these masks to bless our lives, bless our homes. And there's been a bit of a controversy because, you know, the Six Nations have said, the council has said, these objects should not be carved for any reason or sold unless you're an active part of this religion, right? This Longhouse religion. So because I attend so many auctions and fine art shows and things like that, when I come across these faces, these spirits, I buy them. I pull them off the market so I can come and take care of them. I've been fortunate enough to accompany some of our faith keepers and longhouse leaders into museums to look at their collections. And what I've overwhelmingly felt is that, there's been a complicated history behind the carving of these masks and whether they're truly alive, whether the appropriate ceremonies have taken place, whether tobacco has been burned. And there's still contemporary carvers who say, oh, these aren't alive, this is just a representation. And then there's, of course, the longhouse that says, no, whether they've been made alive, they are still a representation of something very sacred. So I bring these things into my home to bless my family and pull them off the market, and I get to educate the dealers. I've literally had dealers say, oh, I had no idea. I will no longer engage in the sale. So it's these little baby steps that help me believe that we are making a bit of an inroad. I mean, there's nothing wrong with people seeing them, but you got to have the appropriate ability to take care of them and talk to them and feed them and stuff. And when it's appropriate, I'll give them back to our longhouse. We actually have a massive amount of masks right now, because even in the Great Depression era, there was an initiative in Western New York to pay craftspeople and artisans money to create outfits, Gustoats, hats, and of course, false face masks. And so there's been a bit of a history. So there's very few old ones out there, but there's a lot of kind of post 1930s and then 60s and 70s and 80s. Some Mohawk carvers and others were pretty prolific about it. So we're trying to get all those off the market. But yeah.
So what does that mean about I'm not quite sure how to ask this question about Native art and whether it's sanctioned, and what that means for museums and people who want to collect these things.
Yeah, this is where that relationship building is important, right? And reaching out to and talking to living artists, or relatives of artists that have passed, and to learn more about those pieces. But I think, really forging and creating those relationships with living artists is so important, because I think, going back to what Dallin said earlier about, many of us, we have that responsibility of, having that, knowing about our cultures and practicing in our ceremonies and things like that. I'm always mindful of the type of imagery that I use, and I definitely don't want to overstep and use something that might be sensitive, that, is not something that should be shared out. And so, a lot of us are very careful and mindful about, what we create and how we create it. Of course, looking at a lot of items that do, that are in these collections, like at the Field Museum, like our ancestors had no choice in those things being taken away from them, or, just kind of being, like they were tricked into selling them, or, what have you. There's so many different ways that these items ended up there. And of course they're beautiful, right? Of course they look like they're art. But they're items that are used, have been used, and if they weren't, laced with arsenic and other, harmful heavy metal pesticides, they would probably still be used in ceremonies. But, I think what our ancestors have done, and what we still, and our people still continue to do today, is to create things artfully, right? To create things artfully, because they're speaking to, the creator. They're speaking to spirits, they're speaking to our ancestors, and that's who they're made for. They're not always made for every one of us to see, right? And I think too, going back to what Dallin said about, caring for these items, that's the part that's missing in a lot of museums in how they care for collections, is, they're caring for these things in that kind of clinical Western, way and not caring for these items, you know, in the indigenous ways that they should be cared for, as if we didn't know how to care for them, you know, before museums came along. And so, and you know, they want to teach us how they care for our items, which I feel, you know, and I'm going to say this, maybe there's some conservators out here, but I really think, and I view conservation of items as if, you know, you're putting things on life support. You know, some of these items they're meant to be used and lived their lives in the way that we live our lives, and then we pass on and we go back into the earth. But, you know, museums have this idea that things should last forever, that they need to made to be last, you know, to be, you know, to last forever. And so they're put on life support so that they can, you know, stay in the museum forever. And they also want to give us the false impression that they're saving them for us and they're saving them for our future generations. But how often does a community have the opportunity to go and visit a museum collection and visit these items and learn from them and learn the technology that their ancestors used to make them? So they're not being saved for, you know, for communities in the future. They're not being saved for my grandchildren. Will they even have the opportunity to go back and look? I feel bad that I have the privilege working at the Field Museum, and having access to collections. You know, I can go down there anytime and see, you know, items that are able to be seen by me. But I only go down there when I'm hosting a guest from that community and we look at the items from their community. And I feel bad that they can only come that one time and see these things. But, and then other people from their communities can't come and see them. And, you know, they're not meant for me, they're meant for them and their community. You know, I really think those communities should have the ability to just come in and say, yeah, you know what, I want to take all of these home because, you know, this is what we need to continue our culture, to let our cultures evolve and grow. And, you know, it's just not fair that they don't have that opportunity. And so when I think about repatriation, I think about, you know, I think it would be wonderful if that was the case where, you know, a group can come in and say, yeah, we want to take everything. And the museum says, yes, okay, you can. I think museums are fearful of that. And that's why they try to, you know, give us that delusion that they're saving these things for us, for our futures, but they would be much better off in those communities. They want to give us the delusion that we don't know how to take care of them. When we've been taking care of them for, you know, hundreds of years before museums. They want to give us the delusion that, actually I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, well, you're talking about there's a different valuation or a different interest that museums have when they see our items, and somehow that has a higher value than what we actually made the items for and what they were supposed to be used for, right? It's completely, it's not like there's some kind of shared interest here. They're completely different types of interest from different values.
Right.
And that's why these conversations have been so difficult because you know, it's you know, well, I'm not going to compare it to anything because it is what it is. It's you know, this kind of Western academic arrogance looking purview towards our items versus what they were really meant for. I mean, and look at the nature of exhibits behind glass with a label. That's exactly what a portrait. That's how a portrait would be displayed in a museum. You know, kind of away from anyone's touch, with a label, maybe a gold a ribbon around it so you don't get too close. and that's it. Separate.
And maybe that's the next step that we work towards after we resolve all the NAGPRA issues, right? Is the repatriation of everything. I think when European museums are giving cultural objects back to African cultures and things like that, I think that's a hopeful step in the right direction. They recognize that these weren't acquired with any real ethic or moral compass. They were taken, they were stolen, much like our objects. And I would hope that just recognizing that would help them see that there's a place for us to take care of our own objects. And what's the answer for, contemporary fine art? By all means, support the artists, help them engage in the natural evolution of some of these art forms. And there's plenty of creative ways that we can display historical objects, but they are in their own appropriate place with Native people taking care of them.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that, and I remembered what I was going to say was that, museums are fearful that if they gave everything away, they wouldn't be a museum anymore, or that Native people or other cultures that they represent through their collections will never come to the museum again. So I think what they're doing is, so they're holding our items hostage, for one, and they're centering our relationships based on those items. They're not centering the relationship on the relationship itself, right? Like, we can build relationships in so many different ways. It doesn't have to be centered on our cultural heritage, our cultural resources. And I think that's what needs to be rethought, because, that's something I think about all the time. I think, because I've heard people say, well, then they're just never going to come back again. It's like, well, then let's build a different kind of relationship based on something else. Let's be friends. Let's, give us the space to tell our stories in the way that we need to tell our stories. And give us the opportunity to tell you what we want to give you for your collection. And I think as artists, we should be selective about where we want our work to end up and where we want our work to live. I want to make sure that my art is in a good home. And if it's not a good home, I'm not going to sell you my art.
Absolutely.
So, Cinnamon, I had a question for you, and I'm feeling like it's floated out of my brain, but it was about the idea of what is in it for a museum to decolonize? What's in it for them?
Ooh, boy, that's a good question, Shannon. What's in it for them? Well, I would say that any kind of strategy that is focused on decentering the white narrative is critical. And that when you do that, you begin to have a much more dynamic, much more experiential, much more resonant museum experience. So if you use the frame of decolonization, and the way I parse that out, this is just me speaking, but decolonization is something a lot of Native folks push back on, and I'm here for that. I absolutely understand why that the goal really is to indigenize the space. I think it's a yes and. I, as a white person, can't indigenize the space per se, but I can start to break down things, break down barriers, break down walls, change norms, practices with the power and opportunity I have so that we can move toward indigenized spaces. When a museum makes the commitment to decolonize, they're making the commitment to reframe themselves in a way that society actually wants. They become more sustainable. We found at the Abbey, when we started doing that work, we did all of the museum evaluation. We needed to make our point and prove it. Guess what? Audiences said, we want to see more stories about lived experience. We want to see how people lived in Maine for thousands of years. We know, they even said, we know these will be difficult conversations, and we're okay with that. And this is, 2012 when we're making these evaluations happen. So it told us keep pushing the envelope because the audiences want it. And our audience has changed. It grew. It got more varietal, more off-season, because very touristy area. You kind of have a pretty consistent visitation pattern in the summer seasons. But in the winter, we started to see much more variety. Many more Wabanaki folks were coming to programming and being at events. All kinds of things were changing. If you're about sharing a story, why wouldn't you want the storytellers all there with you? That's what's in it for museums. A sustainable museum for the future. There's no reward in the other direction. There's really not, except a continuation of power and privilege and oppression, to be frank. Really, if you want that museum, great. Your audiences are going to run out, and I can see it coming. And so's the money. But you can get on the leading edge of it right now and be the museum that we all want. I think decolonizing strategies offer those frames. And I think if you figure out what your framework is to adopt this kind of decolonizing approach, you can apply it in other settings. Like collaboration is for all of us to try to do, right? But it's collaboration at the authentic starting place where you're making decisions about what stories are going to be told. The people who are the storytellers should be deciding that. And then privileging Indigenous voice is the second part of that. That's that decentering of the white narrative. We should all be doing that to bring more voices in. And then truth telling. We should be telling the deep histories. And I don't care if it's uncomfortable. It is what it is. Get with it and start to learn and rethink how you understand the world and how you arrived at the place you're at. I think museum workers have been, those who've really gone through professional pathways, especially, have been trained to be experts, to convey knowledge because people are begging for it. I think this is my training. I mean, it was just how it was. Like, we were so lucky to get these jobs. Somebody there, you either have to know somebody to get a museum job or they have to die. I mean, that's how it's been to get in the museum field. And this is for someone who had privilege coming in. It's an extraordinary opportunity to get to work at a museum. And we are special, but we're not. And that's not sustainable. And that has exacted exclusion and harm. And we need to train ourselves and accept training and accept learnings that give us those platforms for having the difficult conversations, that give us the ability to stand aside, sit down, and let others lead. I know I work on it every day. I really do. But I know that people around me aren't working on it sometimes as hard as they could be. And I think that's what decolonization can offer. Very long answer.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. I hope everyone's applauding that. We've got a couple of questions. Actually, they're very similar questions in our Q&A about replicas. So I'll state both of them. Lillian's asking, is there any type of consensus? That dangerous word, consensus, on museums or private collectors having replicas of sacred objects on display after repatriating the originals? And the other question by Martha, only a chief, she asks, how do you feel about museums to make replicas of our items and give them back to tribes so we can educate our own people, children and grandchildren? So kind of different questions about the use of replicas. What do y'all think?
I think like I think it's case by case. It really comes from having those conversations with those tribes, with the the religious leaders, with to have those conversations and decide. I mean, I don't think it should be the museum to say, well, we think it's necessary for us to have a replica and put it on display. It really needs to be that community that says, you know, if they want that replica to be made and be put on display, I think they have to give permission for that replica to be made in the first place. But it's not, unless that community feels it's necessary, I don't think it is necessary. And I don't think that a museum should keep the original item and then make a replica to give back to the community. It should be the other way around. But again, that's if the community says that that's what we want. Museums really, it's time. Museums have to listen to these communities, to these different cultural groups that they represent. Yeah.
Right. Dallin, do you want to add anything?
I don't really have anything to add. I mean, she said it well.
Well, this issue about I want to bring it back around to the issue of what is Indigenous art. I know the association has taken some really strong positions on trying to warn buyers, people who want to go to an auction house and look at tribal antiquities or artifacts, or look at even sometimes at the dealers in Santa Fe have sacred and other objects for sale. The association always warns buyers that many of those dealers and auction houses don't do their due diligence. Again, if it doesn't violate NAGPRA somehow, then no other laws seem to apply. Even though there's other state, federal, and tribal laws that could apply to an item that's been stolen or looted even 100 years ago. So we try to educate people to purchase contemporary Native art. But the idea of what is Indigenous art, even for Indigenous people, is a pretty diverse discussion, because there's 574 federally recognized tribes. There's more than 300 other tribes that are state recognized or not recognized. You know, how we feel about things are really diverse. And I like, Deborah, how you're putting, you're couching everything in it depends, right? So there doesn't seem to be any easy answer. But, you know, Dallin is an artist. How do you comport with your own tribes multiple, cultural protocols when it comes to creating art, and what does all of that mean to you?
Well, it definitely starts with choice, right? I have a lot of friends who engage in very traditional art forms, and maybe the narrative's very modern because they're speaking in the language of the time in which they live, although the techniques may be hundreds, if not thousands of years old, right? I choose to create art that speaks to something similar. You know, maybe it's very contemporary, maybe I blend materials. And whether it looks Indigenous or not, I don't really care how other people receive it. I make art because of what it offers me in my life and how I feel like I'm living my authenticity as a Seneca and as an Arapaho. And as I mentioned before, generally artists are very well educated about where the line is between sacred and whatever, profane, or just art, right? But as somebody mentioned in the comments, a lot of our art is very functional. It was utilitarian. It was beauty for the sake of beauty, even though it might have been a simple bison horn ladle, right? All these things were reflections of our appreciation for what man above or grandfather has given us. So we reflect that beauty in our art. We reflect that gratitude and that humility, right? There was an instance at Indian Market that a prior director to me had shared, that there was some tribal members who were religious leaders in their Pueblo. They said, hey, we just want to let you know that this artist is creating masks that are too close to what we use in our ceremonies. So we're going to go talk to him. We're going to take them. And the director, he just simply said, okay, great. That's between you and the artist. And that happened, so it's not to say that the line isn't crossed. But again, I think as long as artists are true to themselves and their tribe, there shouldn't be any real issues with the creation of contemporary art and whether it goes into a museum or not. I, like Deborah, am very cautious about the homes my work goes into. I like sometimes having my work go into museums, especially tribal museums, because I feel like it's more accessible there, that people can see it and enjoy it. I had some pieces go into NMAI for a big Plains narrative exhibit. And sadly, the curator who put together the show said, well, they're showing contemporary and historical pieces. And unfortunately, after this show, the curatorial leadership said that the exhibit has to rest for at least 50 years. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's awful. That I may not ever see this piece again, because you're putting your entire person into these pieces, whether you realize it or not. But yeah, Deborah's experience as an artist might be different than mine, so I'll give it to her.
What was the question again?
Just, dealing with cultural protocols and what's okay for you as an artist, because we all know that all tribes are diverse in how they look at these issues. And of course, artists as individuals have different feelings about things as well. So
yeah, I mean, I guess going back to, how things are, our sacred items are made artfully and, with the same technical skill that we put into art that we share with the public, or that art that we sell. It's because as Native people, we like pretty things, right? I think it also shows that, we have the time and commitment and the dedication to beautify those things around us, whether they be functional or art for art's sake. The art that I make it's all, I'm trying to share my experience, my personal experience of being mixed race, Native and Korean, Pueblo and Korean. And so, that's what I do with my art. So my art's very personal in that way, which I guess, for me, that could be sacred. I'm using images of my daughter in her traditional manta, but, I'm not showing her face. So, I'm protecting her in that way. So you see the back of her, she's leading. But, I think for me in the art that I make, I refer to myself as a fine artist, which is different than, traditional artist or, so, and that's a whole other, that's another genre, right? For us as artists, to be a fine artist. And I think, there's also this kind of expectation for Native artists to always, put a feather on it, or to use, images that, that other people can easily identify and live. But I think, as long as you're a Native person and you're creating art, it's Native art.
Yes. I want to invite, please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to join our speakers on audio and or video and ask any questions or be part of the discussion. And feel free to ask any other questions. I really have been enjoying being in your presence and talking about these issues, because these are things that we've never had a space to really talk about for a long time. And the idea that museums are relooking at how they do business, and how that supports repatriation is extremely, it's just, I think the last 10 years are really where we've had these kind of discussions. What do you think? I'm seeing no one's helping me out here from the audience. Nobody wants to join the conversation. And so Dallin and Deborah and Cinnamon, we're getting kind of close to wrapping up. If there's someone with a raised hand. So I'm going to bring up Selena. I'm going to hand you the mic, and you're going to come up on stage with us. Whoops. I'm going to give you the spotlight.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Cinnamon. It's been a long time. I really appreciate the conversation that you were having in regards to copies of sacred materials. I'm kind of curious, especially from the artists, from Debra and Dallin specifically. I'm a member of Museums Alaska, a statewide museum association for the state of Alaska, and we've been having conversations specifically about funding artists and artwork. We actually most recently had a proposal from an institution that wanted to purchase an art piece from a Tlingit artist who is on this path of self-discovery, of embracing her cultural identity. But in doing this, she created a contemporary artistic piece of a mask that's used in ceremony, which is a conversation we've been having in this session. And as funders, I'm the only Indigenous representative on the panel. And I consulted with our tribe on how we felt about it, and we did not agree with the purchase. So I shared those findings with our panel, but then there was a greater conversation about our role as a funder in making those determinations. Are we policing artwork? Are we restricting artistic expression? And how the whole situation got resolved is we went further and we contacted larger Alaska Native organizations who have Tlingit connections, and we ended up not funding it. But I am curious, as artists, how do you feel about funders that are making these kind of decisions, and what kind of consultation do you want to see from us moving forward? As you know, everything is different from tribe to tribe. So I'm just curious about your perspectives on that. And Cinnamon, as well, as an institution who's purchasing Indigenous artwork, what do you think about that as well?
I think I like that consultation and funding too, right? Like, how often do funders or people that are reading grants, do that kind of consultation? So, I mean, yeah, I don't know what I would have done if I were in that situation, but I think the way that you handled it sounds to me like the most appropriate way to have had those conversations, with Tlingit community, and and I hope that that's something that I know notes are always shared back with people that apply for funding. So hopefully the artist, was able to read just some of the feedback and will, hopefully do things differently. And then that comes from that having that cultural responsibility, right, as an artist, and being careful of what you include in your art and what you shouldn't, because I'm worried about what my community would say if I used something that I wasn't supposed to. And I would hope that if I did mistakenly use something, that it would come back to me. That should be a learning moment.
Dallin, Cinnamon, do you want to?
Yeah, I agree. Thankfully, you were in the space that allowed you to ask the questions that needed to be asked. And I don't think, anybody, especially somebody who's learning about their own cultural identity, would be opposed to continuing that education about who they are and what might or might not be appropriate. So I think, in the absence of somebody living in their community who has the accessibility to their spiritual and tribal leaders, maybe sometimes that educational journey does come from the funder who has to ask the appropriate questions. Do you have permission to do these things? And if so, would you please, even if it makes you uncomfortable, hey, this feels a little kind of gray area. Can we maybe have a conversation about this, why you used it and whether you have permissions or not? There's nothing wrong with that. I think people are so conscious right now about this idea of cancel culture. There's nothing wrong with canceling or growing or getting away from the ignorant and into something that's very conscious and a choice that we make just to do things better, to grow from the mistakes of the past. And so whether that's as an individual, as an artist, or as a community, yeah, we can all get there by doing exactly what you're talking about. So I'm glad to see that you're there.
Yes, and I would just add that I would co-sign everything said. I think everything was great that you described, Selena. On a practical level with museums, how to even approach this when it's not in that kind of dynamic, creating ways to be super transparent should always be the norm. And one of the things that was an incredible learning for me at the Abbey, when we had a standing Native Advisory Council appointed by each tribal leader, 2 members would serve, and they were instrumental in our change and continue to work with the board. And we had a meeting once, I can't even remember which community we were in, quite frankly, but we were in community. And the question was asked, what are you collecting? What are you buying? And our assumption was, we did it so visibly at the events we co-produced with folks from Wabanaki communities that we never really had to question what we were buying. And it came to us that they wanted to know what the museum brains thought were important so that they could inform that decision making, but also support it if they needed to. And so it was simple as, because we had a really nice acquisitions budget that we could exercise every year, report back out, this is what we purchased, these are the folks, and this is why. And it would, of course, lead to other roads. It would have never, honestly, as a white person, really happy to work with lots of Native artists, it would have never occurred to me that I needed to create a transparency system in that chain of commerce. So it's just one practical example that I think any museum could think about as they're building tribal relations, is as they acquire, report back and be willing to have a difficult conversation if you shouldn't have bought it and figure out something to do with it. If it's decided, right? Like, you can't have these relationships, report out, somebody tells you shouldn't have it, and then you say, oh, well, that's where our relationship ends. I'm not going to do what you say. So there has to be a practice of being transparent in this feedback loop. And I think it can lead to incredible pathways of collecting and supporting artists.
Beautiful. Thank you all for your answers. We've got Robert Hershey who's going to join us. Professor Hershey.
Greetings, everyone. How are you? Thank you very much and Dallin, it's nice to see you again. I haven't seen you for quite a few years. So hello, everybody. I really don't know how to ask this question, but I'm going to take a stab at it. Is NAG, prior to the passing of NAGPRA, I know that a lot of societies were searching and trying to regather things that have left the reservations, even prior to reservations, things that were taken and stolen. And we could go back into the 19th century and all the military expeditions and and the seizure of ancestors and bones and also sacred belongings. And then the anthropologists came on in the Antiquities Act. There's discussions that were taking place in individual communities, searching to try to find where their sacred belongings and their ancestors were. Do you think those conversations are going on today in the efforts to create some sort of a tribal NAGPRA, their own laws, their own repatriation laws? Or do you think that NAGPRA is the tool that is being used extensively to generate these discussions? How does a community discuss, how do the various communities have these discussions on how things left the reservations? What's the generators of this?
Well, good to hear from you again.
Thanks, Dallin.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. That's a difficult question to answer because I'm not privy to, obviously all the tribes. But from a federal Indian law standpoint, I have heard of conversations about, what are the strengths and weaknesses of NAGPRA, and how do tribes bolster their own policies and resolutions to accept the boundaries of NAGPRA, but create, not only a strengthening of their own inherent tribal sovereignty, but an evolution of the legal processes that they engage in to protect not only existing sacred objects, but to get some of these objects back, right? Now, how far that goes or how those conversations are going, I haven't heard much recently. But I do know some tribes are engaging in it, especially tribes that have tribal museums. You see some tribes like the Seminoles flexing their muscle a little bit and saying, hey, we can no longer in good conscience support NMAI because the Smithsonian institution at large is still holding so many of our relatives. How do we continue in a relationship that is so one-sided? And I love seeing stuff like that. I love seeing tribes engaging and being sovereign, saying, hey, look, if we're going to cultivate this relationship more, there's got to be concessions. You can't just take this paternalistic approach and tell us that's how it is, because we are here and we want to engage in these conversations, but it's got to go both ways. So I do know some tribes are doing it, but as to details and how far along we are, I can't really speak to that. I look forward to the time when NCAI has a whole session on this kind of stuff, because the tribe somewhere has made some kind of big legal victory and brought some of those things home. So we're definitely looking at it and waiting for those days, especially at NARF. We engage in some of this work and we hope to do a lot more. But again, tribes have to reach out. We help a lot of tribes write policy, write procedure, write all kinds of stuff that help them flex who they are as a tribal nation. So we hope to do more of it, definitely.
Thanks, Dallin.
Yeah.
Well, we're about, am I unmuted? Yes, I am. We're about towards the end of our time. There are a couple of polls. I'd like to go ahead and put the polls out. Please, everyone, squash the poll, smash the poll, whatever. Say yes or no to the polls. And if our panelists wouldn't mind, perhaps giving us some final words while everyone votes. No one?
I'll just say a few things, just really quick. There's been a couple of good questions directed my way just to talk about doing the work. And simple answer is flooding people with training opportunities and modeling the way all the time, constantly, and being comfortable with asking questions as to why you're doing it that way, and be prepared to disrupt is how you make the change happen in museums. And then also with that, someone asked about museum studies work, and should there be classes around these issues with Indigenous communities? A big yes, in the sense that this situation in the US of A is particularly problematic. There are problems globally around repatriation, but the US has its particular brand of stink when it comes to how it has created museums and how it has treated Native people, past and present. And so within that frame, I think if you want to work in a museum, you better understand what museums did to people. So yes, there should be training for all of us. Don't let me be the last word, because that's really gross when I, was late. And then
That's okay. I mean, I just want to say thank you again, everyone. I'm just tired, y'all. This is not easy work, to work in a museum and then try to practice as an artist. It's difficult. A lot of my creative energy goes into the work that I do at the Field Museum, but I always just appreciate the support that I get. In being invited to share my experience in that respect, in the work that I do. And so, yeah, I'm just tired, but thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. I know it's not easy. And everybody who's here watching and engaging with us, this is what it's about. We hear perspectives. I definitely am very aware of what I don't know. And I'm always looking for allies and tools and concepts that'll help me just simply be better in whatever advocacy that I am able to engage in. And so I don't typically live in some of these museum worlds that many of you do. But I go to museums. I enjoy them for what they are. And I don't shy away from letting them know when I see something that is uncomfortable, because that's part of just what we're asked to do. We have been educated in art or our histories, or we are simply tribal members, but we have a responsibility to all those people who came before us to assist them in not only returning home, but in having an appropriate relationship with them and the things that they created, because who we are is in large measure because of the sacrifices that they made. So I know it's rough work, but I'm glad that Deborah, that you're there fighting the good fight, that Cinnamon, you're a great ally, and that Shannon, you're guiding these conversations, because they are absolutely necessary.
Well, thank you all.
Everything back.